tell the audience 3 things. Okay, let's make it 5 things.
Okay.
Tell the audience 5 things that they may not know that are important to know about finances. Okay, and I'll give you one. We could count the first one as every time they open a new credit card at the store. It affects their credit score. Let's make that number 1.
That's right, number 1. That's right. You got to realize how to manage your credit score, because your credit score drives a lot of things. It drives employment, drives the cost of insurance, employment opportunities, down the line. So it's important that you know, and everybody wants to know, with your credit score every time you walk into a situation, in terms of getting a loan for a car, buying a house, or down the line, what is your credit score, And so, but in terms of 5 things, yes, credit score, number 1. I have to always say credit is so important, because we live in a credit-driven society. So you have to manage credit well. The second thing is knowing what your financial values are. Now, a lot of people just go through life just doing stuff. They don't really have any values. What do you really value? And those values will determine how you use your money. Do you value having sufficient funds for your retirement? Do you value having sufficient funds to finance your child's education? Do you value shelter? Down the line, what do you value having a real comfortable living? So once you know what your values are, you set financial goals and you develop a budget. So you have those, so you build it around those values rather than just doing stuff based on what Bobby did or what John did or how I feel. But what's my values? When I was in college, my value was to make sure I had a comfortable retirement and I can retire early. So I retired early to set up this organization, because I just drove in my investments, and I managed my spending. I controlled my spending so I could have the base. That was my value. My value was early retirement so I could help other people. And I always make sure, definitely want to have shelter and have funds for my child's education. So that drove my spending. So you got to have your values in place. The next thing, you have to have a good understanding of investments, because there was a study done by the Urban Institute that says that even when you look at wealthy African Americans, they are far behind wealthy white Americans because of the lack of investment activities. What the investments are limited to savings and savings accounts and CDs. You have to understand how the financial markets work. How to invest in stocks, how to invest in bonds, how to invest in mutual funds, because that's where you're going to generate your greatest wealth. In this country, there are only 2 ways you're going to 3 ways, but the third one is chancy. The first one is you got to have home ownership, gain wealth there, invest in stocks and bonds, and the third one is inheritance. But inheritance, you depend on somebody else, right? Yes, I don't depend on that one, but that's about the only way you'll gain wealth. So you got to use that, And the next one is make sure you manage your risk, have proper risk insurance, have the proper insurances in place, because if you don't have the proper insurances in place, you can have a significant medical condition that can drain what you have accumulated, you have to borrow money. So risk management, have the proper insurances in place. And the last thing is make sure you have the proper estate plan and documents in place in terms of wills of trust, because a lot of people have wealth, but they didn't have a will, and now there's a lot of confusion, and the families are tied up, and they can't access it. There was a study done by a professor down at Auburn University, and to look at the heir property in terms of African Americans in the Southeast, and this professor discovered that there was $3 billion in heir property tied up in the black community in the state of Alabama and Georgia alone.
Just in Alabama and Georgia
alone.
Wow.
People died, had a farm, had a house, didn't have a will. Kids got arguing over it, they know they sell it, they can't come together. So you always want to make sure that you have something in place to manage the resources that you leave behind. I always say one good thing about a will, you can control what's happening from your grave.
And it actually costs more for it to go through probate.
Exactly,
right?
It costs more when you get tied up in these legal situations. I've seen some situations where the estate was just diminished because of this legal cost, because they couldn't come together. On it. But the key thing is, you got to have these things in place. You got to have your credit. You got to have good values. You got to make investments. You got to have risk management. You have to have a statement. Have your budget in place and limit your spending. Because I was at Texas Southern University, which is another HBCU.
Mm-hmm.
I had spoken over the school, and I was back in my hotel room, and I was watching the evening news, and they had one of the newscasters going around town, and they have Money Week in Houston. It just started. It was had last week, at Money Week, and
Wow.
they do a lot of financial literacy training on that week. And so they were interviewing millionaires, and the question was, how did you become a millionaire? And the reoccurring answer was limiting spending. So you also, in order to get these things done, you do have to limit spending because casual spending can lead to financial difficulty.